We are broadcasting.
It's great to see everyone again. Welcome to the September IAASB CAG meeting. It's nice to see all of you on video, not quite in person, but still it's good to see you. I'd like to welcome a few of our guests. That includes Tom Stevenson, the IAASB chair, of course, Lynn Dewey, who is the deputy IAASB chair, and Galen, who you just saw, who is the IAASB CAG chair. I'd also like to welcome our PIOB observer, and that's Dr. Chen. Thank you for continuing here this morning. Our official observers are Barb Vanich of PCOB, and she will be here tomorrow, George Cobway of the IMF, and Don McLeachy of the SME practice. We have a couple of new CAG representatives, and that is Mr. Akikoto Ishiwata of the Japan Financial Services Agency, who is replacing Takashi Hawari as the representative of IAASB. And we have a new delegate from the World Bank, Juan Carlos Serrano Moracho, who is standing in for Ms. Examaro Morel. We do have our public observers, which are joining through our YouTube channel. We have a few members that will not be in attendance for this meeting, and they will be able to dial into the YouTube. I wanted to also just reflect, because we have a couple farewells, and one is Takashi Hira, who has represented IAASB since September 2018. So he's made some very significant contributions to the CAG discussion, and we wish him well in his new role. And I'd also like to say thanks to Laura Schiffman, who's represented FEI since September of 2019. Before we start, I wanted to have a approval of the board minutes, and I also wanted to highlight agenda item A1 and to see if we have any comments or discussions on the board minutes. Otherwise, we will go to approval. Any comments? I don't think so. So I think we're ready to go. And I think everyone is pretty familiar with the Zoom protocol. To raise your hand, you will need to go to the reaction function within Zoom. And then once you have been called upon, please then lower your hand unless you have a further comment. Also, just to remind everyone to remain on mute when you are not speaking. And with that, we're going to jump in. I'll also want to remind you there is an EER report back, and that is available in your materials as well. I would like to jump into group audits. Group audits should be very familiar because we've seemingly have talked about this a number of times. And really, this is our last chance to provide our input, because the hope is that the ISA 600 group audits will be approved. So really, we look forward to any final comments you have as we move on. So with that, Lynn Dewey, you've been with us on this for a while, and we'd be very happy to get an update where we stand and our last chance for comments. Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Like what you said, we've been here before, and I was checking my calendar. This is my 10th CAG session, begun 5 years ago. Of course, the last 4 sessions, including this one, is done virtually. So I'm not sure what we're going to do. I'm going to miss CAG very much, even though I'll be still on the board. But we're not going to be talking about 600, hopefully after this meeting. But I want to thank all the CAG members, the new and the old, those people who have been with us throughout the whole journey. I really appreciate your input. This project started back in 2015. and we're all looking forward to the conclusion of this project. And as you know that back in 2015, this project was part of the quality management revision, and because of various timetable and other operating reasons, and also we need time to get ISQN1 and ISO 220 and ISO 15 out the door to build on those requirement principles in those standards. So we took a pause, but now we are in the final stretch, and hopefully to hear from you before we get to the board meeting next week, and also the meeting in December for approval. Next slide, please. So since we met in March, and I want to just rehash what we've done, at least for the March meeting. When we spoke to you back in March, we actually present to you a number of key changes based on what we heard from the exposure period. And in the March meeting, we presented to you a number of key areas, and thank you very much for your input, directions, and a lot of what you have provided us. We also spoke to our board in the March meeting. So from March to June, we actually turned around, incorporate those changes, and in the June meeting, we actually had a first draft for a full read with our board. In the process, since the March CAG meeting, we had a session with key monitoring group members, IOSCO, IFIA. We also had a session with the PIOB and the IFA SMPE committees. And the staff also had a chance to give an update to the PCOB staff. And also a number of works have been done in terms of coordination with other boards and committees, such as the IAASB. There's a specific independence task force being set up at the IAASB board level, and the work has been very well in terms of coordination. I think IAASB has been very responsive in terms of our work in working with us to find solutions. So I just want to make sure that it's on public record that all the amount of work that IAASB has put in to support us. Additionally, less complex entity, which you know about, that ED, there was a specific question in that ED addressing group audit, and so it's a good that we've been coordinating with other task force, and as you know, that a number of other working groups at the IAASB also help us on technology, professional skepticism, and the CUPS project. So overall, a lot of work to be done since March. Next slide, please. You probably have seen this heat map a few times already, and this is based on the comments we received during the exposure period. As you can see, what we have proposed in the green area, we got a lot of support, and in the yellow area, we did received some support, but also there was some concern in certain areas. And the red one, the risk-based approach, that's a key area which we presented to you with our idea back in March, a risk-based approach, the overall audit strategy that has been incorporated since the March meeting. So for this section, I'm going to be very much focusing on what we have done since the March CAG meeting, and hopefully getting your feedback. Next slide, please. So in terms of the risk-based approach, that's the red box you saw earlier in the previous slides. So we work on a number of areas. We work on the structure and focus on the iterative nature of conducting a group audit. The number of paragraphs, we made changes to align with the ISO 15, the risk-based standards. As you all know, that standard is not effective yet. That standard is going to be effective at December 15th this year. But it's very important that we build the risk-based approach in the group audit standards. Additionally, many of you has told us the emphasis on the importance of the role that component auditor plays in all phases of audit. I think Hilda might be one of them in the March meeting made that point, and I think Paul Thompson also made that point. So based on those comments, we made some changes in the application material to emphasize the importance of component auditor in the overall work of the group audit. Next slide, please. So from my perspective, because this is the last time around, I really want to hear from you. And I take it that you have read all the agenda paper that was provided to you ahead of this meeting. And those are the paragraphs listed that dealing with the risk-based approach, communication with component auditors, and some of the linkage to the 315 risk-based approach, and also related ISA 330 respond to assess risk and a number of areas. So with that, maybe Jen, I'll turn it over to you to seek CAG members' comments.
All right, we're ready for some comments. I'll open it up to see who has some comments on 600. Kristen, you're first in line. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. So first of all, thank you very much to the changes that have been made. We are very much in favor of these changes, especially with reference to paragraph 3C and also to the changes in the application material, such as A8 AA and A17A. So that is really, really helpful. And Len, thank you for going this way and reflecting the comments we have made. Thank you.
That's a good start, Len, for you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that support. We did spend a lot of time in those paragraphs, and I'm glad that we get positive feedback at this meeting.
Any other comments? Len, I don't see any on my screen, so I would go ahead.
Okay, Michelle, next slide, please. I think one of the key area has been documentation throughout the project. That has been probably the top one or two public interest comments we heard. As you all know, that ISO 600 is a special consideration standards. It brings all the key concept principle from other ISAs. And for this section, what we're building on is the ISA 230, the documentation standards. And what we have done, what we have changes is based on a lot of good input from regulators, as well as some of the PIOB comments we heard in terms of what consider special consideration, and also specifically the group auditor to document what they have done. The action, demonstrate that action is taken, for example, direction supervision review of the component auditors, involvement throughout the audit, as well as, you have to evaluate the competency and the capability of the component auditors. And lastly, we introduced a number of application material in terms of some of the key elements you have to understand, the group auditors, the enterprise group system of internal control. That's particularly important in a multinational complex type of setting. So with that, I'm not usually not a person to compare. We pretty much triple the size of the documentation standards and application material from the extant standard, because based on some of the inspection finding, based on some of the regulatory input, I think it's very important to highlight some of the things that has to be in the documentation, and to address some of the key public interests. So with that, I will ask Michelle to turn over the slide and open for questions, particularly on the documentation section. Thank you, Jim.
Len, I was reflecting on some of the comments we've previously made as a CAG, And one of the comments was the importance to demonstrating that the lead auditor maintain that role and control, and maybe documentation will, at least in part, helps support that effort. I do have a couple of points. Christian, are you back on this one?
Yes, James, and I would support what you've just said, because Accountancy Europe is in favor of having the group auditor determining the need to review, using professional judgment. So this is really, Len, again, thumbs up, and thank you for changing that.
Thank you, Christian. Conchita.
Thank you. I concur with the comments stated, and indeed the documentation is important, and consideration of the component auditors, although it may be discussed later. So I will reserve some comments on that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. Hey, Len, it seems like you're getting some favorable comments and appreciation that you've reflected some of our previous comments in this particular area.
Thank you, June. I just want to emphasize that throughout the process, I think Willie and Tom has been very instrumental, helping us, give us our guidance in terms of getting to where we are, particularly in the documentation section. There have been a lot of feedback and comments that I think it's a collective effort, and it's good to have both Tom and Willie involved in the process. So with that, Michelle, turn over one slide, please. So other changes we made, I think the key one, the risk-based approach documentation we talked about, but other one in terms of scope and applicabilities, the entry point, I think that we heard from the commenters during the ED process. Also, your comments back in March. So we revised a number of paragraphs to clarify the scope and applicabilities, particularly the entry point. We make some changes to the definition of group financial statement to make it clear what's considered group financial statements. And also that consolidation process, how financial information gets captured and flow upwards. So in the introduction section, there were a number of key comments from particularly from France and other jurisdiction where there might be specific situation, very small entities having to do regulatory statutory filing that has that consolidation process, but how do you, in terms of how to scale that into group audit standards, or whether you shouldn't be scoping. So there were a number of key paragraphs in the introduction section to make sure that we didn't indefinitely intentionally scope some of these small audits into the group audit standard. So those very helpful comments from Europe for us to address that. Next slide, please. And two other key public interest comments. One is deal with communications. Two-way communications, I think IAASB, IFIA, those are very highlighted in their comment letters. You need to continuously having communication between the group auditor and the component auditors throughout the audit. That's also very important in terms of determining nature, timing, extent of direction, supervision, review throughout the audit. So we add requirements to have communication to take place at appropriate time throughout the group audit, and with some application material to demonstrate guiding the auditor what we mean appropriate times throughout the audit, and also very, very specific in terms of the form and contents of the component audit deliverables based on the nature, timing, extent of the work performed. Materiality was one of them, aggregation risk, and aggregation risk was not defined in the ISA literature, and as part of the group audit project, we look into ISA 320, the materiality standards, proposing a definition in that standards, so it's clear what we mean aggregation risk. Then and also defining component performance materiality, and a lot of guidance in terms of how to deal with aggregation risk and component performance materiality in the application material, but also we are planning to look into additional guidance and example outside the standards to deal with materiality. Next slide, please. There are a few other matters we also heard from the commenters and also from this group in terms of addressing them in the standards. For example, application material in the introduction section to acknowledge the importance in terms of how audits done for special different purposes might be used, for example, statutory audit into the group auditors' work. And also we look at into professional skepticism. This is one area that we're trying to align with the quality management standards, particularly in ISA 220, as well as a separate outreach to our professional skepticism working group to ensure that the concept of skepticism is prominently mentioned and also in the application material throughout the standards. Next slide, please. So with that, Jim, I'll turn it back to you for CAG's comments in those areas.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. And I would like to point out, I really would like to hear from everyone, since this is our last chance to comment on this before it goes back to IAASB. So everyone take a chance to reflect on maybe your previous comments and whether those were reflected by the revisions. Galen, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. And I really wanted to comment on the earlier question area on the competency, documenting the competency of component auditors. And in my experience, what you often see is a fairly weak evaluation. And that evaluation typically goes to, well, we recognize that the name of the firm that has done some work, and they're a large firm. And to me, that really isn't enough. And I wonder whether enough application material, is on that particular issue to dive a little bit deeper than that, because large firms have problems as well as small firms. And I think that, that ought to be something that we spend a little bit more time thinking on in terms of the qualifications of component auditors. Sorry that I'm having difficulty figuring out how the new raised hand function works, and I should have given my comment earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Galen. Wei?
Thanks, James. Thanks a lot for the presentation, and I appreciate the task force efforts to address the challenge of group audit. I would like to make 2 comments. And first, I'm pleased to see the task force has addressed the key public interest comments, such as in the areas of effective two-way communication between the group auditor and the component auditor, and implanting risk-based approach in the standards just mentioned by Lynn. And in particular, the emphasis on the responsibility of the group auditor in the direction, supervision, and review of the work of the engagement team, which is in alignment with the newly revised ISA 220. I hope this will drive positive changes in practice and enhance quality management at the engagement level. That's the first comment. And secondly, some of the largest listed companies on the major world stock exchange are multinational entities. enhance audit quality in group audits will benefit the investors, in my opinion. The audit work of those companies involves component auditors' work, which is conducted in various jurisdictions. So the group auditor and component auditor should follow the auditing rules and at the same time observe the rules and regulations of those jurisdictions. So we expect the audit report of listed companies is of high quality as well as legal. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. I think I'm going to stop right there and give it back to you, Len, for responding to the comments. I have some other ones that I recognize here, and I will pick up on them once you respond. Len?
Yeah, thank you. Let me just address Wei's comment. Thank you very much for the support and on the two-way communication and also the importance having high quality audits, especially in the capital market, because a number of large multinationals listed in the world stock exchanges. So appreciate those comments. And Galen, your comments is well taken. You know, the competency, the skill, the knowledge of the component auditors participate in the group audit. We're building this based on what's in ISQN1 and ISA 220. We look at ISQN1, there's engagement resources, and the firm has that responsibility. And then from the engagement perspective, ISA 220, the engagement partner has responsibility to ensure that engaging team members have the right experience, knowledge to perform the audit. So what we have in ISA 600 is extension what's in ISQN1 and also ISA 220, and if that areas that can further align with those two standards, we'll definitely consider that. But your comments is well taken, because I said earlier, this is part of the original quality management standard. It's supposed to work seamlessly. So thank you for highlighting that. Jim, I think that's what I heard so far.
Thank you. We have some more hands, so we have some more comments here. Paul Munter, I recognize you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I think the board and the task force has done some really good work here in developing the standard to this point and being responsive to comments. I guess a couple of observations. One is kind of following up on the point Len was making a moment ago, that in understanding the quality of the component auditor, as Len rightly noted, we have to bear in mind the fact that by the time the revised ISA 600 comes into effect, that the QM standards will already be in place. And so I think the work that the group auditor will need to do and the documentation will tend to fall into one of three buckets, where you're working with a component auditor that is within network. Probably a lot of that work will have been done through the application of the quality management system throughout the network, where you are in a network firm, but you're dealing with a component auditor that's out of network. Then I think obviously the effort that is needed has to step up from there. And third category would be if you're not in a network circumstance, then the effort and documentation would need to be at a much higher level, as I think Galen was pointing out. I also like the emphasis on the two-way communication. I think experience, or at least my experience, has been that oftentimes the communication is the group auditor sends out instructions. At some point, the group auditor gets back a communication from the component auditor, and that's about the extent of the communication. That two-way communication, regular two-way communication is critical and underscores the fact that the group auditor has the responsibility for leading the engagement, including leading the work of the component teams. And lastly, I think the improvements to documentation is extremely important, because, again, the group auditors' work papers have to provide support for the opinion that will be rendered with respect to the group's financial statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Daniel. You may be on mute.
Okay.
There you go.
Here you go. Thank you, Jim. So I think the project is quite robust and such a controversial issue as the relationship between the group auditor and the component auditors. I therefore support the direction that the project has taken, and it seems to me that in general, the concerns expressed in previous sessions have been clarified. So for me, it's a very good project right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Wade, did you have an additional comment? I see your.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to lower down my hand. Sorry so much.
That's fine. Conchita, same question for you. You have your hand up.
I just want to add, actually, the gentleman who just stated his comments, Mr. Munter, echoed what I have to say. And overall, I believe that the team has improved a lot on the report, and I appreciate it very much. Having said that, I would also like to highlight the importance of the documentations and the consideration of component auditors. Well, at the end of the day, it is really the group auditor that takes responsibility over the group audits, but due diligence and care to be undertaken so that the component auditors are aligned to the direction, as well as perhaps the supervision given also by the group auditor. That's all, and thank you.
Seemed like a fair number of comments on the importance of the two-way communication and the evaluation. Christian, your hand's up.
Yes, thanks, Chairman. I just wanted to get back to Galen's initial comment. Paul already responded to this in a way I would have addressed as well, talking about the ISQM ones, which we have to take into consideration as well. Nonetheless, I think there are two more things to add. Just as a practitioner, you always should also look at the regulatory environment this component team is working in. And last but not least, the team itself, the team structure and the knowledge the team has. So, I think, Galen, that was your point. I think these things need to be addressed within the audit instructions, and then you get back the feedback. And then, as mentioned by Paul as well, and previous comments, that we need this two-way communication. Absolutely correct. So I'm very supportive of that.
Christian, do you think there needs to be more information or more written in the application guidance on this, or do you think it is sufficient as it currently is?
As I said, I do think it is worthwhile mentioning that there are several dimensions, not just one or two. But at the end of the day, if there's application guidance, that will be helpful. But overall, I think looking into what I've seen, some already asked these kind of questions and received the answers to that, take them into consideration. Others don't. So it might be helpful to add this, James.
Okay, and I'm going to ask the same question, Paul, not to put you on the spot, but Paul Munter, do you think there needs to be anything additionally written in the application guidance, or do you think it's sufficient as it stands?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting.
Yes, I do that.
I guess I would say, generally speaking, sufficiency is in the eye of the beholder. I think where the board is now is, I think, strikes a pretty good balance. I think and I think the board does this, leaves open the possibility that they could provide additional educational or other non-authoritative materials later as the need arises. So I think they should obviously monitor feedback as they go forward. But at this point, it strikes me that I think they have a pretty reasonable balance here.
Okay, thank you for that perspective. Billy?
Thank you, Jim. And maybe just to highlight also what Lynn said earlier, in terms of the link to ISQ1 and in particular ISA 220 revised, which applies at the engagement level. So this is an area where the task force spent a lot of time to strengthen the standard in paragraph 21 around engagement resources, particularly under the heading when component auditors are involved. And I just want to point out that there's considerable application material already added from paragraph A40A through to paragraph A45, where we've also tried to emphasize the special considerations in the case of a group audit when you would apply the ISA 220 requirements. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Billy. Those are all the hands I have up at the moment, Lynn. Perhaps you can respond to that, to those questions or points.
Yeah, thank you very much. Galen, Paul, Conchita, and also Conchita, your written comments are very helpful before the meeting. And we try to strike the right balance. As Woody pointed out, we spend a lot of time and with alignment with the ISA 220, and of course after the approval of the standards, we'll make sure that in terms of monitoring the implementation and also perhaps thinking about how 600 is working with 220 and other QN standards as part of the assessment as well. So thank you for your support. Of course, we'll bring some of the key changes that Woody talked about in those paragraphs he referenced to our board next week. So we'll take their comments as well. So and hopefully by December we'll have something that people will like in terms of addressing some of the comments that's been raised so far. Jim, so should I continue?
Yes, I just have one, before you do, I just have one point, and that is you referred to this as a specialized standard, and I know that's been discussed quite a bit at the IAASB level, but maybe you can share to all the CAG members what that the context of it, or a little bit of the background on what that means.
Okay, so so in principle, when you do a group audit, the entire body of ISA literature would apply. For example, I mentioned ISA 230 dealing with the documentation. You look at engagement, quality management, ISA 220. Of course, the ISQ1, the key component, I think Paul and Galen talked about network quality management. And also, not to forget, the risk-based approach is very much based on what we have done in ISA 15. So those are some of the key foundational standards. Then you bring other standards in, for example, materiality, I talked about, aggregation risk, that concept. Then the special consideration, for example, in a group audit setting, a fraud, a going concern, communication with those in charge of governance. So all the principal and key requirements are in other ISAs. So when you do a group audit, you don't just go straight to ISA 600. You have to make sure you understand all the key foundational standards as well as all other auditing standards in the body of ISAs. 600 is a place to take you and provide guidance on specific practical issues and a number of other issues when you apply ISAs in a group audit type of environment. So that's all we mean is a special consideration standards. In practice, I think one of the key comments we heard leading up to the project proposal is in practice, people just go straight to 600 without have a full knowledge of other ISAs. So this is something that we try to emphasize in the introduction section. We even in our drafting, if you look at some of the requirements, we use the language in applying certain paragraphs, certain requirement in 220, 315, 330, then the group auditor or the group engagement team, they have to perform requirement based on the requirements in those other standards I referenced. So in a nutshell, is 600 is not a separate standard. It's a separate standard in the body of literature, but it's built on all the entire body of ISAs. So I'm not sure that helped the CAG member at least to understand what we mean special consideration standards.
I appreciate it. Thank you for adding that clarification. And now I think I don't have any hands up, so Lynn, feel free to move forward. Oh, Billy, take that back. Billy, go ahead.
Sorry, Jim. I just wanted to add to what Lynn said. And I agree fully with everything that Lynn said, and also in terms of why we refer to this as a special consideration standard. Another way to think about this is that those special considerations are driven by the fact that in the case of a group audit, you have components whose financial information is aggregated through a consolidation process. And that leads to questions that you need to address around what audit work needs to be performed at those components and what the resources are that are required to perform that work. And that actually comes out very nicely and very strongly in one of the enhancements that we've done post-ED by adding in paragraph 17A around the overall group audit strategy and group audit plan. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Billy. Okay, Lynn, I think we're clear to move forward.
Okay, Michelle, next slide, please. Effective date. Since this is the last time we are talking to CAG, so raise the effective date issue with you. From what we heard in the exposure period, as well as in our outreach, the number one comments we heard is making sure there's enough time for translation, adopting to national standards. Also, there's a number of significant changes needed to be made in the firm's methodologies and also training as well. So a lot of support for an 18-month implementation period, but majority of people don't want to go longer than 24 months. Also, there have been a number of standards, new standards being in the pipeline for the practitioner to implement. For example, we talk about the quality management standards, the 315 will be effective later this year. So that's what we heard overall. So taking account all the comments we heard, also look at the quality management standards that's going to be effective next year. Our proposal is for the standards to be effective for the financial reporting period beginning on or after December 15th, 2023. So basically, it's for the 2024 calendar year audits. So this will provide appropriate time for implementation, and also you factor into the board will approve the standards in December, and PIOB will go through a process. So likely PIOB approval will be around the first quarter of 2022. So we're looking at a 21-month implementation period. Next slide, please. So this chart illustration is just to show you the timeline. We're having a board meeting next week, and December is the approval, and expecting the PIOB approval in March. So with the 21-month implementation period. Next slide, please. So I think this might be the last question in terms of getting the view from the CAG in terms of the proposed effective date for ISA 600. So with that, turn back to you, Jim.
Thanks, Lynn. And I was looking through my notes from our previous discussions, and I think the implementation date, there were a number of comments in the past. So I'd be very curious to hear from all the members what their perspective is on this. You said 24-month. implementation date. I think that would be good for the IAASB to hear that feedback. So I will open it up, expecting to hear from you all. Perspectives. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's an awful long way up. I understand with the updated work plan, et cetera. My assumption is that this is as realistic as they can get without pushing back other priorities. So with that in mind, I support it.
Thanks, Paul. And perhaps Len, yeah, I know this isn't exactly your area, but you do reference the QM standards, and can you talk about the interaction there, or about the QMs coming through, or maybe Billy would want to do that, and how that may affect this date as well?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. I think Willie probably have in terms of staff's work plan, how to align this with QM standards. I think from a 600 perspective, one of the key standards that we mentioned, also Willie mentioned, was 220. And during the exposure period, also through outreach, practitioners were asking questions how 600 work with 220, if 220 and 600 are having a different effective date. So at least internally, the staff and I have looked at it, and we feel that at least the new revised ISO 220 will continue to work with the extant 600. But in terms of there might be some guidance needed in terms of bridging that time difference. So the staff on the 220 task force and 600 task force, as well as the task force chair, at least after the December meeting, once the standards approved, we'll look into whether a bridging document is needed, at least to try to align with the engagement quality management standard with ISO 600. So that's the discussion we have so far in terms of the two standards that most interlinked, the 220 and 600. Maybe this is probably a good time for Woody to come in and talk about what the other staff thinking about the QN standard 600 in terms of the alignments.
I think that might be helpful. I do have a couple of hands up, but I think that might be helpful, Willie. Really not to put you on the spot, but go ahead.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Jim, and Len has provided a good introduction to that. I think this issue also came up when we were approving the QM standards, whether ISO 220 revised will be able to be applied together with Extant 600 if the effective dates are different. I think the first thing to note is that this is not an unusual circumstance. I mean, we revise standards all the time, and you always have a situation where new standards or revised standards have to work with extant standards. I appreciate that in this case, it's probably a little bit pronounced because of the significant changes to ISO 220, but as Len has indicated, that was something that the ISO 220 task force kept an eye on while they were finalizing ISO 220 last year. So we've had initial discussions at the staff level between the project teams for the 600 team project and for the 220 project in terms of if there was a need for some type of, as Len referred to it, bridging material, what that would be like. We do think that if there is that need, it will really be very high level, just to indicate how what the principles are that will apply. And also keeping in mind that we're really talking about a bridging period here of just 1 year. So, it would be counterproductive to invest a lot of time and effort into comprehensive guidance that has a very short shelf life. And that's why if we undertake something in this area, it will be high level, just to give users the comfort that the link is there and 220 revised is capable of being applied together with Extant 600. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Willie. Paul Munter.
You know, figuring out effective dates is always a bit of a balancing act. I think what Willie and Lynn have described here is the right thought process, that you've got to think about the sequencing of implementation of existing standards that have been issued and are not yet effective is certainly part of that, and the responsibilities that places on firms and networks as they're implementing existing standards. On the other hand, you have to balance it with the fact that you're talking about improvements in the standards, which presumably should lead to improvements in audit quality, which is clearly in the public interest. And so you want to try to achieve those improvements as soon as possible. So we're really, I think, trying to balance those two aspects here. And it strikes me that the timeline that Lynn has laid out is a reasonable balancing of those competing forces here.
Thank you, Paul. Galen?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Paul just said. My natural instinct is to say, this is a pretty important project, and it does impact audit quality, and we should expedite it if we possibly can. Which brings me to, could it be done in steps? Do bifurcate it? Is there, considering the global meltdown in the economy, you're going to have problems there as a result of the pandemic, all of which has occurred very recently. Could it be applied initially to listed companies and then taken into consideration, the LCEs or privately held companies? Are they going to take a little bit longer? Would it be worth at least thinking about that? And I understand the training and the ramp up. I mean, this isn't something that is going to happen overnight. So, it is a matter of balance. And I think on balance, I think that, a 2-year period overall does make some sense, but could something be done in terms of steps or awareness that the board could take to try to expedite this as quickly as possible, to try to minimize the fallout that is almost inevitable because of companies that are struggling?
Thank you, Galen.
Thank you.
Asha?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. The effective date should be okay unless there is a possibility on expediting it, because generally the date will further delay for local implementation due to administration related work like translations and gazetting done by the local standard. Apart from that, I just want to make an overall comment on the standard. So we as a regulator is supportive of the overall changes made in this standard, in particular relating to the requirement on the two-way communication of the group auditor and the component auditor, especially when the group auditor is not from the big four firms. So now currently we don't see much involvement, kind of like a two-way communication happening in based on audit inspections. We are also in favor of the group auditors assessing the need to go through the working papers of the component auditors, particularly when the balances are coming from the component financial statements. Like sometimes we see like where the expertise are needed for the balances of component financial statements. And when there is particularly relating to valuations, when there are concerns relating to the assumptions made by the component financial statements balances, how it had come. So we don't see that kind of extent of checking, going through the working papers to see whether it's whether the balances are okay or not. So overall, I think the group audit project is actually is commendable. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. Don McCleachy, with respect to SMEs, I know you were relatively vocal in previous meetings on this, based on where the standard is and based on the effective date. Does that align with the SME constituency? And I also will ask the same question to Christian. I know you've commented several times today, but from the timing perspective, does that work? And as well as Natasha, I believe you had some comments on timing in the past as well. So if any of you have any further perspectives, let me know. Paul, your hand's up. I'm not sure if you have an additional comment or if it's a lingering hand. Okay, I don't see any other comments on this particular. Len, I'll turn it back to you for response.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you very much for all the comments, especially on the effective date. Of course, we do try to achieve the right balance. I know the thinking is to propose the December 15th, 2023, 2024 calendar year audit, but I think at this point that I would think early adoption would be allowed and also encouraged. So really that depends on circumstances and how the firms, the network, and national standards decide to do. But I think from our perspective, reflecting all the comments we heard, it's 21 months after the PLB approval, but to a certain extent, if early adoption is a benefit to the public interest, I think that's one thing we will definitely consider. Asha, thank you very much for your comments. I think a number of issues we raised, that's exactly what we try to address. The component auditor and group auditor, two-way communication, direction, supervision, review, and also we talk about involvement of expert. I think that's what you said at the component level. There's certain paragraphs in 600 deal with that issue, looking at, a component auditor may have to engage outside expert, provide assistance. So a part of the competency evaluation of the engagement team. So thank you for those comments. And but again, I think we really appreciate all the helpful response comments so far. And as I said, it's been 5 years, and appreciate you follow this journey with us. I think Willie has his hand up, so Willie, you might want to come in.
It does. Before Willie speaks, so I think rumor has it, Don, you had the applause emoji. I wasn't sure if you wanted the applause one, which would be great, or the comment one, which would be great as well. But Don, I'm gonna put you on the spot here.
Sorry about that. No, I was just going to jump in to say the feedback I had before the meeting from the S&P AG was that they had support for the ED and how they were moving forward, and they felt that they had been really responsive to all the comments that we had provided. So our thanks for that.
Thank you, Don. And Christian, your hand went up for a moment, and so I just want to see if you had a further comment, or maybe you had the applause emoji as well.
No. Just because you put me on the spot, I think we do have 1 year of difference, and I did make the comments on the ISQ1 suite, including ISA 220. I think there will be a implementation phase anyhow. So overall, I think we can all live with what is now proposed.
Thank you. Greg Ruthman, from a public sector perspective, any additional comments from you on that? Well, I'll let you think about that. I will go back to Willie.
Thank you, Jim. I just wanted to also reflect on Galen's comment, which is well taken. I think when it comes to effective date, this is always a very difficult puzzle to fit. And there's always the temptation to say, let's implement this early, or I think Galen made mention of a staged approach. Our past experience has shown that the stage approach doesn't really work very well. If we look at the earlier date, the most benefit you can probably get is 12 months, but then you have to weigh that against, balance that against what time do you need to really realize the benefits that have been built into the standard, and to realize those quality outcomes. And often that takes time in terms of allowing a period of around, and that's why in most of our EMs that go out, we go out with a proposal of around 18 months, because that is the time it takes. And so there's also an argument that if you force it to be a rushed implementation, you may actually get the opposite result of what you intended. But I also appreciate, like I said, I fully appreciate the view. It's always a difficult puzzle to fit, but I also appreciate all the comments that on balance, it seems as if we got that balance right. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Billy. I don't want to prolong this too much. I am going to call on Natasha in a minute, but Greg, you have your hand up and specific to the public sector.
Thank you. Just in response to your question, Jim, I didn't see anything specific to public sector with respect to implementation. There's simply a number of standards coming online around the same time, which is fairly typical. It may be worth reflecting on reporting impacts. If standards that are changing the auditor's report, if the audit report changes could be implemented simultaneously, that might be helpful to the user community rather than having an audit report that's changing on an annual basis. But that's not specific to the public sector.
Okay, thank you, Greg. A good perspective there. Natasha?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I don't really have much to add apart from my little chat note around, yes, yeah, I understand the complexities. There's always complexities, but when there's a will, there's a way. And I certainly think that, for investors and the public, the sooner we do these changes or implement these changes, the better. I had another AOB point, Jim, but that may come later, probably. I'll leave it to you to judge.
Go ahead. We have some time, so feel free.
Well, this is more just a generic point about whether we can add agenda items. So it's not particularly around this discussion point. So maybe that's better for the end of the meeting.
That might be good. Maybe during the private session.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. All right. I don't see any other questions. This is your last chance. Anyone else? Okay, well, I think we have we're ahead by a couple minutes, which is unusual, but I'll be happy to take it. And we will have a break. I'm going to stick to the times because, of course, we're also on YouTube, and we will reconvene at 10:25, and we're going to talk about the work plan. And we did have a lot of discussion on the work plan and the importance of the CAG providing their input early on in terms of the items that are going through the work plan, and there is the priority framework, and there's a lot going on that area. So I think we're going to have a lot of good discussion for that. So I will see everyone back at that's 10:25 Eastern Standard. Thanks, everyone. All right, I'd like to welcome everyone back. There's everyone. Our next topic for this morning is the 2022-2023 work plan. And I think it's very important that we provide our input. We always talk about ways that we can strategically provide guidance and advisement to the IAASB. And I think this is a great topic to do that because the work plan is being developed. And also, I think there's something a little bit different this year, and this is the framework and how a particular agenda item makes it through the agenda. And so I think this will give us a chance to hear a little bit more about this, even though I think we've heard about it in the past. I think it might be good to reiterate some of that and how the planning is done. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Tom and to hear about the work plan. Tom?
All right, well, I'm going to be joined by Billy and Bev too to help me out here and set me straight where I get this wrong. I always find it's a little strange that we do 2-year work plans when we all know that standard setting, the average lifetime project is more than 2 years. So that's something I've learned over time, is that sometimes things don't make perfect. And we're, as you remember, right in the middle of our strategy period, which is a 4-year period. So basically, this is a work plan that comes in halfway through our strategy process. And, you know, I just wanted to remind you that that process that happened in 2019 and ultimately drove our strategy of today, adopted in 2020, was adopted after significant consultation. And as a reminder to you, our strategy really, and I hope we live by this, calls for our board to put the public interest at the heart of everything that we do and really adopt a public interest lens. And to do so successfully, it's about getting the right projects on our agenda in a timely fashion, about being an agile and innovative standard setter, and really increasing the level and intensity of our interaction with stakeholders like the CAG and your relevant bodies, national standard setters, other official bodies, and all of those who have an interest in our standard setting efforts. And, you know, we did this consultation, and it was in the form of a survey. So just remember that. So we don't have a lot of comment letters on the side. But what was great is taking our innovative and agile thing and our desire to have an intense consultation, that we had over 100 commentators participating in the process, which actually is a step up from previous consultations on the topic. So that input has been really, really helpful to us. And Billy and Bev will talk about some of the details. But one of the things that we've learned is that there was lots of affirmation about our current priorities and the importance of completing what we're doing, but also a sense of, you know, based upon our new framework of activities, is how we should prioritize going forward. And, you know, one of the things that came clear in my mind reading things is that we may actually have several parallel streams, particularly with the demand on assurance creeping up our agenda, that, you know, may have a number of audit related projects, but we may also have assurance related expertise needed in projects going on, as well as some demand for narrow scope amendments. So really, I'm going to hand it over to Billy and Bev, but it's a really important to us, not even if it's for the immediate to what our work plan is going to be tomorrow, but for what happens to our work plan once projects come off. And as you know, 600 is sort of hopefully first to clear. So we will have some thoughts about what's next. And of course, that will follow our process that we've set up under the framework for activities. Billy?
Thank you, Tom. And we can have the next slide, please. So as Thomas alluded to, that this is really just filling the gap in our current 4-year strategy period. But from a due process point of view, it is still very important that we engage with CAG. That's why we also engaged with you last year when we were developing the survey and proposing the approach that we applied this year. The survey closed on August 5th, and I really want to make a special mention of IAASB staff here, because it was truly a team effort to have 100 respondents come in by August 5th. And we were able to analyze those comments and get an issues paper and a first draft of the work plan to the board for our discussion next week. From a strategy point of view, and this is really just what the first slide refers to and that Thomas alluded to, is we are comfortable when we went out on the survey that our strategic objectives as they are reflected in our current strategy remain relevant, and that we can continue to use these to drive our efforts in terms of the work plan. What you will see is that how the work plan has been developed based on the results that we've received from the survey is really in 3 main areas. So we focus on the completion of the projects that would be ongoing at the beginning of 2022, at the beginning of this work plan period. Then there's also a focus on a number of our ongoing work streams. And then lastly, there's a focus on the pool of possible topics that may become the IAASB's next project or projects as capacity opens up and as staff resources and board resources allow. So in the survey, we presented our stakeholders with 8 candidate topics that we thought based on and Dave will talk a little bit more about our framework for activities, just to remind everybody. But we presented our stakeholders with 8 candidate topics that we believed are probably the ones that will next meet the criteria in the framework and might be eligible for being our next project. As it works out, based on the responses we've received, respondents were broadly in agreement with those 8 topics, although obviously within the different responses, the relative importance across those topics differed. But respondents also suggested a few additional topics, and we've recognized that by also expanding that list of initial 8 topics that we had in the draft work plan that was shared with you. So what we propose to do today, before we get CAG members' input on the proposed work plan, is that I'm going to hand over to Jasper, that will talk about the survey results and the responses that we've received and how we process those responses. And then Bev will do a little bit of a deeper dive on the actual work plan and also give some background regarding the framework for activities. So Jasper, I'll turn to you.
Thank you, Willy. And Michelle, can you go to the next slide? So as Tom mentioned, we received over 100 responses from stakeholders all across the world. So that's we're very happy with that. I think this was a record number of responses for strategy and work plan consultation. So a few interesting things that I would like to highlight on the responses. But relatively, there were a lot of individuals where we got input from. Normally on a consultation, we get like a few individuals who respond, and now we had over 30. The other thing is that there were relatively a lot of small and medium-sized practitioners that responded. So out of the 23 accounting firms that responded, 16 were small practitioners. And lastly, there was only one monitoring group member who responded, IAASB. Normally you have more monitoring group members who respond, but of course, some of the monitoring group members are also on the CAG, so they're able to respond to our work plan through here. So Michelle, can you go to the next slide? I'll tell you a little bit more about the development of the survey results. So as noted on the slide, this was not a number counting exercise. So we looked at the responses from different angles and to see which stakeholders groups said what. For some of the questions, we received a consistent response. So for example, we had a question about whether we should continue with our current projects. And there was across all stakeholder groups, there was broad support for doing that. However, for some other questions, looking at the responses from different angles did provide some interesting insights. So for example, on question 5, as Willie alluded to as well, like the respondents were asked to rank 8 possible topics. Individuals generally ranked analytical procedures and audit sampling higher than assurance on climate risk disclosures. While if we looked at the organizations that represent a significant number of constituents, like they generally ranked climate risk disclosures higher than analytical procedures and audit sampling. So there were some interesting thoughts and views we got through that. Then in the development of the survey results, we also noted that some themes came up in several questions. So in analyzing the comments, we grouped those responses to these themes under one question. So you'll see that in the agenda item where we summarize it, we all grouped those together. So for example, all comments related to audit evidence and the ISA 500 series more broadly, we grouped those together under the question related to the current work plan, as we have our project on audit evidence. This is what we did for several topics that came up, also climate risk disclosures or climate matters about climate more broadly and non-financial information more broadly. We all grouped those together. Then lastly, as Willie also mentioned, it was a true team effort. I'm very proud of how we all got this together in such a short time for you and the board to discuss. And Beth, can I hand it over to you for a high-level overview of respondents' comments?
Thank you. Michelle, next slide. So I think what we heard in the work plan, and which is represented in the draft work plan, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail, really is that there was, and as Jasper alluded to, there was strong support for completing what we started. So at this CAG meeting, both today and tomorrow, we're talking about various of these topics. There wasn't very many people that said, don't finish what you've started. And I will talk a little bit more about sort of us leaving open room if we do need to pivot or we need to make changes as we go along when we discuss the work plan. And as Willie again had also spoken about, is that we had provided sort of 8 of the topics that in our minds had sort of bubbled up a little bit. We hear a little bit more about it on outreach, we hear from in meetings, and we provided the 8 topics. And again, we asked people to rank those topics. And those topics across the board, they came the results of that was broadly that ISA 330 should really be the next topic that comes for various reasons. And reasons were provided, not everybody provided reasons, but a lot of it was around the revision of ISA 315 and the interaction of 330 with ISA 315, but also to be consistent with what's happening on the audit evidence project. So again, there's a number of projects either completed or that are sort of being revised at the moment that will impact ISA 330. So that sort of rose to the top. The next couple was sort of various people had them as preferences, but we need to look at it, and I'll talk about our framework and how we will select the next topic in a minute. But assurance on climate change disclosures, analytical procedures, audit sampling. So various stakeholder groups and no sort of common theme as to which stakeholder group, but those would be sort of the next ones that are sort of bubbling up. There were a couple of additional ones that we didn't have on our original list. So assurance on non-financial information more broadly. So in the 8 topics that we provided, we had really honed in on the climate change disclosures. But it came a very strong message that you need to look at it more broadly than just the climate change disclosures. Obviously technology, which we have ongoing efforts on technology, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then materiality is one that we hear about now and then, but it did come through a little bit more strongly in the responses. So in the draft work plan, you'll see that we've also added those as possible contenders for our next topic. And then we'd also asked about what we call our narrow scope maintenance. So in our framework for activities, we have sort of our information gathering, and that will sort of tell us what we need to do. Do we need to do a broad standard setting project? Do we need to do some non-authoritative guidance? And we've built in this new sort of work effort that we can do called narrow scope maintenance. So this is something that's very targeted. So it may be sort of one change in a standard. It may be one standard with a couple small changes. It may be a certain topic that's targeted across a number of standards. And I'll use most of you hopefully will remember the disclosures project. So that would have been a narrow scope maintenance where we really honed in on disclosures, but it was across a number of topics. So that's sort of in our toolkit now as well. And we'd ask some questions around possible topics, and we got some very helpful feedback from that. So putting all of that together, we developed the draft work plan, which is what we've provided to you. So Michelle, if I could have the next slide, please. So taking into account what we heard from our stakeholders, I think the first thing we're very clear on, and obviously we've got to have this discussion with our board next week, but we're very clear that we've got to finish what we started. What you won't see there is ISO 600. ISO 600 is due to complete this year. I think we're on track for that. We do need to put aside a little bit of capacity early next year for the implementation activities, but ISO 600 broadly finished. But then we have all of the other topics. Some we've already discussed today, some we'll be discussing tomorrow. So that's fraud, going concern, completing the LCE standard, although there were mixed views on the LCE standard, but very balanced. The regulators in particular, a lot of them don't service that community. So they thought that our resources were better placed elsewhere, but that was very much balanced by a large number of other stakeholders that we also represent that have urged us and encouraged us to complete the LCE standard. Audit evidence, we also have the POWER project, which you discussed this morning. Obviously, that's going to take some resource. And then towards the beginning of next year, we're going to complete what we call our CUSP project. So that's on the complexity, understandability, scalability, and proportionality. So those are the big, broad sort of topics that we need to complete in 2022 and 2023. As you can imagine, some of those are big, substantial projects. For example, fraud, and we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. It's going to be a big project. So although ISO 600 is completing, there's some big projects sort of already lined up to come in and take capacity. So the reality of it, and when we do our planning, and again, we've done our planning and we do it on a detailed quarterly basis. We've done it on an in-person basis at this point in time. That may change. We may have changes coming through from COVID and the ability to travel. So we may need to carry on going virtual, in which case some of the timelines may push out. We may have changes coming from the monitoring group changes that will be coming through in the next sort of 2 to 3 years. That may result in more capacity. It may result in less capacity. At this point, we haven't adjusted for those monitoring group changes. But based on sort of our normal progression of projects, where we think these projects will go, what we think will be big projects, what will be smaller projects, we sort of see our new projects, 1 or 2 projects starting in 2023. So next year, largely full with some of these ones that I've just spoken about. And then in 2023, as those complete, we'll be opening up. Remembering that staff and working groups start to work on these topics a lot earlier than we start to bring them to the CAG or into plenary sessions at the board. So it usually has sort of an 8 to 10 month lead time. So towards the end of next year, we'll be thinking about what our next project will be. And that's coming on to that and thinking about what our next project will be. And it'll be selected from the ones that we've got in table B within the draft work plan. That's the sort of list of the ones that what we call have sort of bubbled up. So we're hearing more about them, that they're a lot more visible in the environment. Those are the ones we really need to think about. So when we put together our strategy for 2020 to 2023, we developed, and some of you may or may not remember, but what we call our framework for activity. So this just puts some structure around our processes and our procedures, and to give transparency as to what we do and why we do things. And in particular around the selection of new topics for projects. And one of the components within that framework for activities is what we call the information gathering and research activities component. So that component is really to identify emerging areas that require focus, which is what we're doing now. It determines our future work activities. So we do a whole lot of sort of information gathering, so sort of scanning the environment, looking at all the input from projects, from the what we hear on our outreach, etc. And we use that information to scope our projects. And we've got various categories within that component. We have what we call the category A topics. So that's the category, sort of the big part of all the topics that we can possibly have. So if there's something that relates to standard setting, we put it into category A. So we've got this big spreadsheet that we collect all of this information on. And as we hear more and more, we're adding more to the category A topics. We then use those topics to really pull them out, and which is what we did for the survey, to try and work out which topics will then move to what we call category B. So really, to get into category A, you've got to be related to standard setting. We put you in our category A topics. For category B topics, this is really trying to understand a little bit more and evidence whether it's within our remit and there is actually something we need to do there. So trying to work out what we have, can we do standard setting? And we've got some criteria that we'll put the topics through. So those 8 topics that we originally had, and then the extra ones that we've got in table B, they will be put through our criteria, and those criteria will then determine what moves to category B. Category B is where we do much more targeted information gathering, and that's where the fraud and the going concern projects would have been last year. So we did a discussion paper, we did some roundtables, really trying to work out what the issues are, and then making sure what we whatever lands in the project scope is actually going to address those issues. And at some point during that process, we moved from category B to category C, where we're actively developing a project proposal. And that's where we start having board plenary discussions. So you can sort of see the ramp up of a topic. But the criteria that we put the topics through, I'll just remind you, is really thinking about whether an action by the IAASB will be in the public interest. Whether the alignment of whatever it is within our remit for standard setting or other focused activities. For example, on fraud, we heard a lot of what could be done. A lot of it's not for us. So we obviously have to scope that out. So we're really trying to focus on the standard setting so that we can target our energy. We have to think about the prevalence of the issue globally. So it may just be in one jurisdiction, which would be nice to help that jurisdiction, but we've got limited capacity and resources. We've got to really focus on issues that are going to have a global impact. Is board action necessary to maintain or enhance the quality of engagement? So we'll think a little bit more about that. And then obviously the urgency of the issue. So in particular, and I'll use non-financial information. There's a lot going on in the environment. And as other jurisdictions start to develop other standards or whatever it is that they're doing, it starts to result in fragmentation, which is not very good. It's not in the public interest. So it's slightly more urgent for us to take action. So weighing all of those up, and we will take those topics that are sitting in table B, we will put them through those criteria, and we'll work out the 1 or 2 topics that will come onto our agenda sort of in 2023. We will then do much more targeted information gathering activities. So sort of what you saw happening on the fraud and the going concern projects over the last 18 months. So that's how it's really intended to work. That's how we got to those topics. So there's a lot of work that gets done behind the scenes. And then all of that put together is sort of how we've come up with this draft work plan. So this draft work plan, because of the substantial projects we've already got going underway, you won't see a lot of change, in particular in 2022. But we did A, have to do it from a due process standpoint, but B, just have a check-in with our stakeholders to make sure that we are still doing what the stakeholders need. So we've developed the draft work plan, which you've got and which we'll open up for discussion now. You will see in the draft work plan, we sort of explain what our current projects are, what the future topics could be. We explain a little bit about the framework for activities. And then we have an appendix explaining sort of the types of work that's being done in each of these projects. And I think we then also obviously have the resources, and we always need to think about resources and capacity. We always need to think about something urgent could come up, and I'll use COVID as an example. So last year, COVID came in. Who expected that? We had to maneuver ourselves so that we could develop guidance. It was in the public interest for us to put our resources there, and we were able to do that. So we always have the ability to sort of perhaps slow projects down, move our staff around so that we can react to the environment. And then, as I mentioned before, obviously we need to take into account the monitoring group proposals, which may impact this work plan period. We haven't yet built in anything for that. When it happens and when we have some more certainty around how those will sort of be rolled out, then we'll make adjustments as necessary. And obviously, as we make those adjustments, we will come to the CAG. Previously in our work plans, we used to have a detailed sort of work plan by quarter. We have that on our webpage, and we'll continue to have it on our webpage. We haven't included it in the work plan for this year. We've put sort of the next targeted milestones, because I think that's probably the most interesting thing to people. And if they do want to see sort of how we'll get there, you can always go to the website. And the reason for that is because of the nature of what's been happening over the last 18 months. It's been very difficult to have sort of a set work plan. It's changed every couple of months, and you would have seen, we would have sort of, as we've kept in a virtual environment, obviously we have less time with the board, less time with the task forces. So we've had to perhaps extend some of the topics because we don't have that sort of targeted time with them. And we may need to do that again. So we thought it's easier to keep that detailed work plan on the website, where it's more of a living document. We can update it as necessary. And as we do that, obviously we'll let our stakeholders know that there have been updates. So I think with that, Jim, there's probably, sorry, is there another slide? Sorry, there's one more slide, just a way forward. So we're going to complete, obviously take any comments from this meeting, from the discussions with the board next week. We will make changes for that, and then we will approve it at the December 2021 meeting. We still obviously then have to take it for PIOB approval, so we'll publish the work plan in probably about March 2022. But I'm very interested in hearing your comments about where we've landed, in particular on the work plan and some of those future topics that we have in Table B, and sort of how we propose to sort of apply our criteria at the appropriate point to work out what our next topic is. So with that, Jim, I will hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bev. This seems like a little bit of a different approach. I guess it allows you to consider more issues as they're coming through. Any comments on how a topic moves from one silo to the next that you could add for us? How it moves through the process?
Oh, sorry, was that me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the criteria that I spoke about. So really, it was sorry, let me just grab it. So it was the action on the topics in the public interest, the alignment with the board's remits, the prevalence of the issue globally, whether board action is necessary for quality engagements, and the urgency of the issue. So we'll sort of put each of those topics through that filter, and obviously it'll be a judgment as to which one will come out. But we'll have those discussions with our planning committee, we'll have those discussions with the CAG, we'll have it with the board to decide on what the next topic is, so that there'll be transparency around the process.
Great. I think this sets it up well for some comments from the CAG. And let's see, Hilda?
Thank you, Jim. I was not the first to put up my hand, so I just wanted to alert that.
That's fine.
So many thanks for the presentation. I think you have alluded in various ways to sustainability assurance or assurance on climate change. And I think it's worth to make a few more general observations around this. Many of you, but maybe not all, are aware that in April this year, the European Commission has actually proposed that they will require mandatory assurance on sustainability information. So that's ESG, environmental, social, and governance information in the European Union for all large entities. That's 50,000 companies, or about 75% of the company's revenue throughout the European Union. So this is a massive change from something which is now voluntary. And this is going to start with a mandatory limited assurance on sustainability information. But in, let's say, 3 or 5 years, there will be a review of that. And then there is the firm objective, the end goal is that there is reasonable assurance on sustainability information reporting. And I have to add that in the proposals made, the Commission says for this reasonable assurance, once we get to that step, we will adopt a standard for this, or one that they can adopt from another standard setter, hopefully the international one, or one that they would set themselves if they would not be having a reasonable assurance standard or standards for sustainability assurance or ESG assurance from the international level. So that is what is going on in Europe. Probably this is the first region where there is going to be mandatory assurance, and in maybe 5 years, reasonable assurance on sustainability information reporting. Obviously, if you look at the global level, most of you will be aware that the IFRS Foundation has decided to set up the International Sustainability Standards Board, and they will set sustainability reporting standards, starting with climate, but most likely not stopping there. So once you see this reporting standard coming, there is an expectation that's fairly soon assurance thereon in some form or level will also be considered. So we in Europe have started to look at this as almost a once of a lifetime opportunity to actually really look into what will be needed in let's say 3 or 5 years to actually meet those requirements, because we expect that sustainability reporting will very quickly become almost as important as financial reporting. Sustainability reporting is used instead of non-financial information now in Europe, and so we expect that this will come at the same level of financial reporting very quickly. So I thought it was important to make you aware of this and indicate how important that will be. And then looking at the work plan that you have put up and have proposed. So obviously, we would be very supportive that you complete the current projects which are in table A, and then going to table B, which is the new projects. There is the subcategory of audit. There is one on review and there's one on assurance. We assume that the first one there mentioned is each one the one which has the most traction or the most likelihood that you would take forward, and they seem to indeed be the ones that we think you should take forward, like on revising ISA 330, revising the review standards or interim review standards, and then what we just talked about, sustainability assurance. And on the others, I think there might be much more debate on what you would need to do. And I guess you will do a root cause analysis for each of them to decide, is there a revision needed? Should we really do this? We hope that gives you a little bit of insight into what we think would be most useful and what we think very quickly will become actually very needed worldwide, especially on the assurance. It's assurance on sustainability. It's not only about climate, it's much wider, it's ESG, and it is not only limited assurance, but it's definitely reasonable assurance. And if I may add, the ISAE 3000 is a very good standard, but having the possibility of limited and reasonable assurance in one standard, we note here in Europe seems to confuse a lot of people, not from the profession, but especially the policymakers and stakeholders. And so I think it's good to give that fair consideration. Can this be done in one standard, or is this really different standards? I think I will stop here. I hope that was clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hilda. And it does seem like it's an issue or a subject that is getting awful lot of attention. But Tom, do you have a perspective you want to share on this?
Thanks, Hilda. Thanks, Jim. The assurance topic for non-financial information is an issue that we are paying very close attention to. In fact, we are actively trying to increase resources related to this. So we are in position to act. And I think one of the things we want to do with this work plan is to signal our receptiveness to act, but also to act in a way that's useful. I think there's a couple of things on my mind right now as we sort of steward the board through its next phase, and as ESG information is becoming more and more relevant. And the first thing is that at this point of relatively early development, it's not early, but it's still nascent relative to financial reporting. It would be a sad state for us to encourage fragmentation at this point. And I do think from an assurance standpoint that we're in a pretty strong place to move forward. And that I wanted to signal, we know that we're not at the end point, but 3000 EER 3410 provides some basis for moving forward. And we strongly encourage us to build off that across all jurisdictions. And I've been speaking to policymakers around the world about that we are receptive to acting. We do need to understand, though, is it a 3000 question from a principles level, or is it the need for more specific standards for which we then need to understand what the reporting requirements are going to be, or is there some other deficiency so we could actually target the most efficient action in it? I think Hilda raised some real good points too about reasonable versus limited assurance. And I'm a little bit worried that policymakers think that limited assurance is an easy way out, which it's not. You still need the same preconditions for an engagement. So in many ways, it entails significant work. And for users of the financial statements and other non-financial information, it could mean more work for them to understand the nuances of limited assurance engagement. So I think for all of us involved, it's important for us to keep educated about what these terms actually mean. Again, we're receptive about doing things, and maybe we will have to diverge our standards, but limited and reasonable, have to have specific standards. We just need to know where will we best place our energies going forward. Do we have to move some of the guidance into requirements? All of that is a possibility, and that's why we structure approach. And then finally, there was a comment about how this is moving so quickly. And I honestly, I have a little bit of a concern as a standard setter about, this is not to say that non-financial information is less important than financial information, but I have spoken to regulators about there is some risk of conflating financial and non-financial information into the same integrated report with the same assumed level of maturity. And so as we take these efforts on, and we will with all seriousness and dedicated resources, we are doing it also with some caution about the level of maturity that needs to be ascribed to non-financial information and assurance as those systems underneath mature. And I'm sure it's going to mature quickly and maybe more rapidly than the financial side, because you have the benefits of those years of experience behind you. But that sort of encompasses our thinking of it, is that we're clearly dedicating resources and time going forward for it. We're really concerned about the risk of fragmentation. We need to have really specific sense of where we should go next. Also conscious of the reporting side is evolving rapidly. And so is it revisions to 3000? Is it augmentation to 3000? Is it specific information? This could all be information we need, and maybe Hilda, and with the Europeans and the Americans and other jurisdictions now thinking really hard, we need to sit down to figure out what would be our next best step from an assurance standpoint to build on the core which already exists today.
Thank you, Tom. You always have to remember that 3000 is out there as a baseline. Natasha.
Thank you. And actually, I hope this follows on rather neatly from those comments, because I guess my concern is that a lot of attention now shifting to non-financial reporting, which I think actually, frankly, is totally appropriate. But where I have a difficulty is that not enough attention is focusing on the audit-related issues, particularly with regards to climate change. So I see in your work plan, you've got it there under assurance. I'm wondering why it's not under audit. And I say that, I know the IAASB published a staff bulletin back in 2020, I think it was October. I've been very heavily involved with many other investors. In fact, it's over 100 trillion AUM, calling now for the financial statements. So I'll reiterate, the financial statements to properly reflect the material climate risks. And with that, we've also been calling for auditors to make sure that they are looking for and identifying misrepresentation with regards to those very same risks. So an easy example, you've probably heard it before, it's one that we used back in 2017, but is led to actually quite significant changes in their financial statements, which is Shell, Royal Dutch Shell and others would publish their forward-looking long-term commodity price assumptions that they were using in impairment testing and various other items on the balance sheet. And they were using prices that clearly did not take into account efforts that were already underway for decarbonization. And that's something that we highlighted, the ones that we were focusing on. Just to give you an example of why this is relevant, Shell, Total and BP all brought those assumptions right down from roughly between $75 and $80 a barrel looking forward down to 50 to 55 a barrel in just 2 or 3 years. Now, that has had quite significant impacts. I mean, multi-billion-dollar impairments, but they are clearly the leaders. And what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to say is that this is very relevant. There's very keen investor interest in this. I don't see it in the work plan in this form. And I would very much encourage the IAASB to do what it can to build on what was a very good staff bulletin back in 2020 in terms of taking that forward to actual implementation. It's very clear that the companies I've noted are the leaders. Hardly anyone else in a review has been undertaken. It will be shortly published, a review of 50 large listed companies, fossil fuel related, not just oil and gas, but in all different sectors. There's basically red flags on every single one in terms of complete failure to reflect these shifting economic circumstances linked to action on climate change. And I think the IAASB, going back to your initial comments, Tom, that you have public interest first and foremost in your mind, should really be taking a lead on this. We've just had the IPCC's latest update on the science. It's really quite frightening. I don't think they're overstating it, and the auditors have such an important role to play. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And that certainly could impact lots of different businesses and industries. Kazuhiro?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for a detailed explanation. I think assurance on climate change and on non-financial information are of great importance as a project too. The guidance was issued recently, but in Japan, the Financial Services Agencies Council has begun to consider whether the TCFD item disclosed on statutory annual report or not. And I hear that the IAASB, established by the IFAS Foundation, will also develop standards for climate change disclosure in June 2022. In addition, in recent years, there has been an increase in demand for disclosure, not only in the field of E, such as climate change, but also in the field of S, such as human rights. And opinions by evaluation institutions for these disclosed information are also beginning to influence the investment decision of institutional investors. However, while the demand for disclosure of non-financial information is increasing rapidly, it seems that the quality of disclosed information is not always sufficient. A few years ago, there was concern that by requiring a assurance, the company would only disclose the information with assurance and hesitate to disclose other useful information. However, in recent years, various disclosure rules are being introduced, and the need for assurance such information is expected to increase. From an investor's point of view, such information is from the perspective of single materiality, which is the impact of climate change on company's financial position, is important. But in the EU developing disclosure rule, information on the impact of a company on the environment is also important. There is room to consider building block disclosure of information for investors and other stakeholders, such as establishment of multi-stakeholder expert consultation committee by the IPAS Foundation. I think the standards developed will be probably based on the perspective of single materiality, and I agree that from the perspective of double materiality, it seems that there are difficult problems such as criteria for judging the materiality and what is considered to be a misstatement on information disclosure of impact of a company on the environment. But I think it would be better to start considering the issues regarding assurance on information disclosed from the perspective of double materiality. Thank you.
Thank you. It seems like we've struck a conversation in this area. Akihito.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much for your great presentation. It is very helpful for me to catch up. I have two brief comments or observation. The first, sorry, let me repeat that sustainability reporting, including climate change reporting, is expected to move fast in the near future. So regarding the assurance of this reporting, the status of the movement need to be watched carefully, and the timing of making a project need to be considered. It is very important, I also think. I'd like to say again. The second, I'd like to thank and respect the IAASB members again for their hard work on various projects. Maybe this is just a reminder. I think it is important to have a project work plan with some buffer considering their resources and contingencies. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Akihito. Conchita.
Thank you. Actually, I made an earlier comment under a different topic. The need for assurance, reference or standard, considering the growing need for it. In some jurisdictions, I would like to take note that there are moves to legislate reporting standards with respect to matters pertaining to climate change or ESG in general. And it's a question of whether the standard setter will wait for legislations to be in place or set the standards for that. There are reports that have been rendered and they are varying in terms of coverage, in terms of emphasis, and it's evident that there is a need to undertake this project. On a related matter, I also noted that if this project will be undertaken, there is a note that was presented in one of the slides that the many projects identified as possible candidates plus the current projects and other initiatives presumes full utilization of resources. The question that I would like to pose is, with that premise, and let's say more focus will be given to assurance with respect to ESG, what would be needed by IAASB to make it happen if all of its resources are presumed to be in full utilization? What support system is needed, or what additional resources are necessary? Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. I know that that's a consideration when they look at resources. They do consider how many are needed for a project. But I have one more hand up, and then maybe Tom or Bev or Vili can respond. Paul, go ahead.
Thanks, James. And thanks also for Tom's intervention in response to Hilda. Not surprisingly, representing a European organization, our concerns are somewhat similar to those expressed by Hilda from Accountancy Europe. And that is that, you know, we have perhaps a once in a lifetime opportunity here to get started in the development of reasonable assurance standards for non-financial information, or ESG. You know, I'm well aware of ISAE 3000, and I've gone to a fair bit of trouble in any interventions that we've had with officials at the European Commission to remind them of the existence of this standard. Not sure whether they're necessarily hearing all of that. What I was especially concerned by was a recent Journal of Accountancy article which summarized a survey on sustainability assurance in the United States. And basically, this article, I just quote for you, said that although about 51% of companies globally are obtaining assurance on their sustainability reporting, there is not consistency in the type of assurance involved. The United States is a good example where non-CPAs dominate the field and different assurance standards are being used on engagements. I guess my concern is just, you know, is lack of a suitable standard part of the problem? I don't know. I'm just speculating aloud. You know, it does concern me that non-CPAs who are not necessarily subscribing to a robust code of ethics, that are not necessarily undergoing professional education and training and CPD, are offering assurance on sustainability information. And which is why I am at least encouraged by the fact that the IAASB has started to elevate the attention on this specific area, as we can see in the draft work plan. And finally, the draft work plan overall, I think, is a very good document. Apart from the ESG piece, we're very supportive of it.
Thank you, Paul. Daniel?
Thank you, Jim. I agree with Paul. I'm the same line. I think it happens something similar to another topic that I see it's very diverse regarding the application of this matter. I'm talking about the internal control evaluation. I know that the ISAE 3000 is the general standard for assurance other than historical financial information, but I believe that the evaluation of effectiveness of internal control should be treated separately. It is true that some countries have developed local standards for those purposes, but it's a large issue that is a bit loose in international regulation, even though, as I said before, some countries have special standards about this topic. I have seen different treatments, at least in my region, Latin American region, about the assurance when it's related directly with internal control, not as part of a financial audit, but definitively a specific topic of evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I know we're reaching our end of our time frame here, but I do want to be sure to get everyone. Mauro, do you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Just a very short thought. I was wondering if the lack of investors among the respondents could be something that we have to consider. Because I am sure that 100% of investors are interested in ESG and non-financial reporting, and presumably this could be at the highest level for their interest in the field. So just to consider this fact that presumably the results of the responses has a bias in the sense that we don't have respondents from the investors' world. And especially from valuation point of view, I have to say that this is something that we are considering because we are pressure from investors and valuers to consider ESG and non-financial reporting information. So just to underline this issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Mauro. Well, it seems like we have a pretty consistent topic on our mind relative to the work plan. So Tom or Willie or Bev, I'll turn it back to you for comments.
So, first of all, it's not surprising some of the comments we received, but much appreciated. I agree with the basic theme of we have a real opportunity on the assurance side, in addition to the other topics that we've discussed today. This is a slight plea for people. This opportunity is also a challenge for us right now, because what I do see is a real risk of fragmentation at this point in time. I caught something in Paul's comments that whether people are listening, that 3,000 exists. And that is my concern, is if major economic blocks of the world decide to go their own way, after decades of trying to get common global standards on the audit side, and at a moment in which assurance and non-financial information is growing more and more, that we will break away. So my plea is for those who have the voice the ears of those who have a policy voice here, please indicate that we are ready to act on this topic. There's a lot to be done. I think Maura's point about investor involvement, and I certainly have seen Natasha's comments in the notes as well. But we do have a real opportunity here, and we're willing to do it. Also, don't forget, we haven't been sitting on our hands on this topic. We just issued EER this past year. So, but we know that there's more to go. We know we have to act agilely. I think our LCE work shows that we can act in an agile fashion, and we're willing to dedicate resources to this topic. What I take on the other points is that continued support for us to complete what we've started on our other efforts, and some really good inputs about how we think about what's next on a work program. Billy, Bev, Jasper, anything you want to add? I'm conscious that we're over time.
I'll just quickly add, there's a suggestion that we look at the investor submissions to the UK government's consultation. We will have a look at that. We have reached out to certain stakeholders where we saw that they hadn't responded, monitoring group being one group, but there were a couple of others and most of the people we reached out to said they weren't going to respond. But perhaps we can think a little bit more about how we can sort of try and pick up what investor views would be on this. So we will think about that. Thank you.
Nothing further from me, Tom.
Thank you, Billy. Very well. Fascinating topic, good conversation. Thanks everyone for your input. And with that, we're going to transition right now to audit evidence. Sue Alman, I assume you're in the blogosphere.
I am.
And welcome. I will turn it over to you for a report back.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Very pleased to be with you. I think Michelle's probably just loading up the slides as we speak. So the presentation here is really just to give you an update on the progress of the audit evidence project since I spoke to you in March. And at the end of the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for any comments or questions as we work towards preparing the first full draft of proposed ISA 500 revised for consideration by the board in March 2022. The meeting materials included a report back on the comments from March, and obviously where we've responded to those. Next slide, please, Michelle. So this, I think, is probably very topical. I know you've just been talking about the work plan, so I think you're probably up to speed on the timeline and potential revisions there. Obviously, since February, there's been a number of developments, and you've seen the changes to the timeline in the proposed work plan. So where we are now is that the intention is to have an ED for approval in September 2022 and finalisation in 2024, so 15 to 21 months after the ED. Obviously, that depends on a number of factors, particularly the ability to return to face-to-face meetings and so on, and the availability of board time in the light of all the things that you've been speaking about. But the task force is working flat out to make sure that we have the material developed and we are getting good quality material in front of the board. Next slide, please. So this slide sets out the specific issues we discussed with the board in March, and these are the proposals that we talked to you about in March as well, and got your feedback on and fed that into the board's discussion. I'll share the board's feedback on the topics that we discussed as we walk through the rest of the slides. But I also wanted to pick up one of the points that came out of our discussion in March, which was about liaison with the other working groups. And we have been undertaking a lot of interaction with those working groups. Firstly, the technology working group. Just so you're aware, I am a member of the technology working group, so I am always very alert for areas where we can draw on their expertise. And on at least a monthly basis, the staff of the task force are meeting with the staff of the technology working group to discuss touch points and overlap, and we have had some good input from those groups. Since March, the staff of our task force attended a meeting with the technology working group where we talked about a lot of the possible implications of where auditors may use automated tools and techniques to assist the auditor in performing audit procedures. And the technology working group has provided some really valuable practical input on possible examples about automation bias when using automated tools and techniques. And that will be considered when the task force develops application material.
I'm kind of worried about that credit report going out on the 1st of September.
Is it possible to mute the background? Thank you. Okay. And clearly we expect there'll be a lot of ongoing input from the technology working group. They're particularly valuable to the goal of modernising for technology. We've also had a lot of interaction with the other task force, particularly the professional skepticism working group. You'll see that was one of the key issues that we brought to the board in July, and also the CUSP working group, because we are probably the first standard where we will be operating under those new guidelines. Next slide, please. So this slide just sets out the issues that were discussed with the board during the July board call. And those included things like the work effort when considering relevance and reliability of information intended to be used as audit evidence, and the proposals for professional skepticism and reinforcing that with respect to audit evidence, and the purpose and scope of ISA 500 and the requirements that should be in that particular standard. And I'll cover these as we go through the presentation. But the way I've structured this presentation is to really look at the objectives of the project on audit evidence and to illustrate how we've addressed those so far in the work that we've done. And we tried to color code this because at the stage we're at now, a lot of the really meaty issues have been discussed with the board. There's a number where we've got very clear agreement and direction, and those we've highlighted with a green blob. Others where we need to do a bit more work where we've got an orange blob, and then there's a few issues that are just in the grey boxes where we know that we still need to do work, and the board perhaps hasn't had an opportunity to discuss those. Next slide, please. So walking through the project objectives of the audit evidence project, the first objective is to clarify the purpose and scope of ISA 500 and the relationship with other standards. And this has taken us into some fairly theoretical conversations, but I think we're making good progress here. So firstly, we explored the meaning of audit evidence and audit procedures, which we discussed with you in March, and we had good board agreement on those two issues. And that really underpins a lot of the further work on this project. So in terms of the definition of audit evidence, information has to be subject to an audit procedure before it becomes audit evidence. So the input-output model that we discussed last time. The meaning of an audit procedure, the board was very much of the view that any procedure that is performed in accordance with a requirement of an ISA is an audit procedure for the purposes of obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And what that means is that audit procedures therefore includes all risk assessment procedures, all further audit procedures to respond to risk, and all other types of audit procedures. And some of those include some of the reporting elements because they all provide an element of evidence that leads to the conclusion. And that's an important clarification to the scope of the standard, because it means that every piece of information that's used by the auditor is subject to the requirements of ISA 500, so including the requirement to evaluate the relevance and reliability of information that's intended to be used as audit evidence. Next slide, please. So in July, we also looked at the core requirements that need to be in ISA 500 to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, and the relationship of ISA 500 with other ISAs. And we had a couple of flowcharts to help bring some of this to life. The consideration is important because it drives what specific requirements need to be in ISA 500 itself, taking into account what requirements exist in the other standards. And those core requirements to be included in ISA 500 were determined on the basis that ISA 500 itself is a reference framework for the auditor throughout the audit when making judgments in relation to audit evidence. So as the auditor works through the various ISAs and performs work, ISA 500 is the backdrop for performing that work and the framework that needs to be kept in mind. So that framework needs to address the full input and output model. So the input, the information to be used as audit evidence, the process of performing audit procedures on that input, and the output, which is the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. So the board was broadly supportive of the notion that the ISA 500 is that reference framework. And with that clarity on the scope, we can then move on to the requirements that need to be in ISA 500 itself to create that framework. And that's what we term the core requirements. So we did an exercise to work out where those core requirements currently sit in the ISAs and considered whether they are appropriately located to create that complete framework. And where we are at the moment is that currently 500 has requirements that deal with the information, the input, and the processing of the information. But there's probably a piece that we need to look at around more specifically addressing the output part in 500. So addressing the conclusion on whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. So that's what we're working on at the moment, but that clarity on scope and the feedback on which specific requirements need to reside in ISA 500 will now put us in a good position to finalise the detailed objective for the board discussion. Next slide, please. So the second objective for this project is to update the standard to recognise that there's been an evolution in information sources available to auditors, and particularly the availability of external information. And I think we've made a lot of progress with the board in the discussions we've had in March and July. Firstly, we've been working on developing a principles-based requirement when making judgments about the information to be used as audit evidence. So a requirement that applies to all sources of information and all information regardless of what format it may be in. So whether it's digital or physical or what have you. And building on that principles-based approach, some of the things we're going to do are removing some of the outdated statements that are included in the standards, such as external sources are more reliable than internal resources. We all have access to the internet, and I'm sure we appreciate that that's not necessarily the blanket statement that it used to be. So that generalization isn't appropriate. We are looking to be clear about the auditor's required work effort. We probably had the first discussion using the work that the CUSP working group has done to work through which verbs should be used to describe the work effort and what those verbs specifically mean. And we've agreed with the board that the appropriate verb is to use the word evaluate when looking at the work effort. So evaluating the relevance and reliability of information to be used as audit evidence. But I think what's important here, and I appreciate that there was a kind of scalability question came up last time I spoke, is that doesn't mean you have to do exactly the same work on every piece of information. There's an important qualifier in the material that we discuss with the board that really drives scalability, because that talks about information is sufficiently relevant and reliable for the auditor's purposes. So, for example, if you're using a piece of information for a risk assessment procedure, so that's the auditor's purpose, the degree of reliability might be quite different from the reliability that you need if you're using that information for a further audit procedure to respond to an assessed risk of material misstatement. So if it's something that is more attention directing as opposed to providing full substantive evidence, there may be different purposes. So we recognise we've got some work to do here still to articulate that scalability, but I think we've had some good input from the board. There was some confusion about what sufficient means, so we're going to take that away and build that out more in terms of the specific context we're talking on it. And we're also working on application material to illustrate the scalability of when the type of work that would be relevant. So next slide, please. So this slide sets out the further proposals that the task force has set out in relation to information to be used as audit evidence. We've developed some application material on the availability and accessibility of information to broadly explain that if information isn't available or accessible to the auditor, then it can't fall within the scope of the standard. But in providing direction, the board also asked us to explore alignment with similar guidance that's in ISA 200, which has got some useful material on the kind of balance between cost and benefit in relation to information being available. So, for example, there might be circumstances where the costs to obtain evidence outweigh the benefits. But the board noted that obviously that shouldn't stop auditors from pursuing such audit evidence, as there may be circumstances where it might be the only or the best audit evidence available. So we looked at things about looking at the reliability of a piece of information, so the attributes such as completeness, accuracy, authenticity, and bias, which might be different depending on various factors such as the source, what am I going to use the information for, the form of the information, how it was obtained. And we've been working on developing application material to explain that not all attributes apply in all situations, and therefore that shouldn't be used as a checklist, which I think, again, was one of the concerns that came up here previously. And there's a number of things that affect what to focus on, how much work you have to do to evaluate the reliability of the information. So we've been presenting that material to the board along the way, and although we haven't specifically gone through it in detail, our sense is that there is support for the progress we're making there. Next slide, please. The other piece that falls under this objective in the project proposal is sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And in March, the board considered the proposed changes to the definitions of appropriateness of audit evidence and sufficiency of audit evidence. But on balance, we decided that the current definitions should be retained, largely because changing the definition doesn't necessarily drive a change in auditor behaviour. And that's one of the challenges we've been having all the way along. So unless we're driving a change in behaviour, it may be better to leave things alone. So we will need to do some tweaks to purely align terminology, but that will probably be the extent of the changes there. Having said that, we did have strong support from the board to introduce the factors that the auditor will consider in evaluating whether audit evidence is sufficient appropriate evidence. And we presented those to you in March, and they're listed on the slide. So we will continue to develop the application material to describe those factors, which will be helpful, I think, also in reinforcing professional scepticism. The other point we explored with the board is the concept of persuasiveness, and the board supported the proposal not to define the concept, but to build it into the application material, and that's something we're working on. Next slide, please. Oh, I might have slipped one. Sorry, I think, okay. Okay, one of the drivers of the project was the evolution in different information sources available to the auditor, and the principles-based requirement to evaluate the relevance and reliability of information applies to all information irrespective of its source. So we plan to address the different sources of information and how the source may affect the auditor's consideration when evaluating relevance and reliability through application material. In March, we presented some proposals on information support sources to the board. There were quite a few comments in there, particularly actually around where the various external sources relate to the defined term of external information source that was introduced as a conforming amendment from ISA 540. There was also a lot of discussion around the notion of auditor-generated information. We're not sure whether that needs to be retained as a separate source. So that's something that we are continuing to work on. And the one issue we need to explore further as a task force and with the board is the attributes of completeness and accuracy. There's a requirement in Extant 500 that specifically talks about the attributes of completeness and accuracy. And we've got a bit of a tension here because I've mentioned the task force considers the attributes that might be applicable in a particular circumstance will vary. And by calling out specific attributes, there is a bit of a tension with a principles-based requirement. So there may be circumstances where accuracy and completeness are less relevant or applicable. So the board acknowledged this, but also expressed concern that it's an area where there are failings in practice. So on balance, the board has asked us to retain that is in the public interest, to retain the requirement that calls out the attributes of accuracy and completeness, and we're working on that. Next slide, please. So the third objective for the project was modernising 500 to be applicable to current business environment and the digital era. And the board supported the approach that we proposed around developing principles-based requirements that can be applied irrespective of whether technology is used or not. But then in the application material, to build out material that emphasises the use of technology. So technology might be used to perform audit procedures, information may be digital, and so on. To have guidance that points out that in some circumstances, because of the form of the underlying information, an automated tool or technique may provide audit evidence of a higher quality when compared to manual, or that the auditor may need to use an automated tool or technique because a manual technique may not be possible. That's not mandating necessarily the use of automated, but it's recognising some of the changes in the business environment. So we've been working with the technology working group to develop examples to demonstrate how the principles can apply when technology is involved. And we've learned a lot from developing those examples, in that they are hard to develop in a way that is technology neutral. And we don't want a bunch of examples in the standard that can become outdated. So if we move to the next slide, what we talked about with the board in July were proposals as to how we can present examples that overcome some of those problems, and also manage the length and complexity of the standard, which I know, again, is something that was raised here last time. So in application material, we propose including examples that are essential to understanding a concept, but are succinct and are not prone to becoming redundant or outdated. We then propose an appendix or appendices that are succinct examples and not prone to becoming redundant or outdated. And then in a separate publication, to be developed concurrently with the revisions to the standard and issued with the revised standard, to include examples that need to refer to specific technology to be able to develop a particular principle. So they might become outdated more easily, or they might need a bit more detail. So we will work with the technology working group to develop those. The board has supported that approach. So the draft of 500 for March 2022 will be developed on that basis with the examples. One piece on technology that we haven't got to yet is following up on the exceptions when using automated tools and techniques in performing audit procedures, particularly whether the exceptions affect the relevance and reliability of information. The technology working group has done some thinking in that area, including a presentation from the UK FRC on the work that they recently published. So we have some thoughts under development. Next slide, please. And then the final objective for the project proposal deals with reinforcing the exercise of professional skepticism with respect to audit evidence. And that was a large focus of the discussion with the board in July. We went back to the 2015 invitation to comment, which explored material on skepticism, and the board discussions that followed that. And we've identified a number of suggestions that were relevant for this project. Obviously, since that ITC, a number of other projects have been undertaken that address skepticism, such as ISA 540 on estimates and 315 on risks and 220 with quality management, which addressed auditor bias as well. So we are working on a number of enhancements to ISA 500 to echo what's been done elsewhere. And we think that will be important to build into 500 because it's a foundational standard that works across the standards. So the slide sets out the proposed new requirements or enhancements to existing requirements that we have talked through with the board to reinforce professional skepticism. And that includes designing and performing audit procedures in a manner that isn't biased towards obtaining audit evidence that is corroborative or excluding evidence that's contradictory. When there are doubts about relevance and reliability, to obtain additional information. If a requirement is added into 500 to conclude on sufficient appropriate audit evidence, then we would also again build in consideration of all evidence, regardless of whether it's corroborative or contradictory. And the focus of the standard throughout is really about driving auditors to obtain relevant and reliable audit evidence. If the audit evidence isn't considered relevant or reliable, then they drive the auditor to obtain alternative or more information. And I know we've spoken about external sources, and that's really where this comes in, is that alternative information may be external to meet the requirements of relevance and reliability. So the board was supportive of that direction on the requirements, and obviously we're working through the feedback from the board. Next slide, please. I already mentioned 220 has been a key input into the discussions and thinking, because it talks about the impediments to professional skepticism and talks about some of the ways in which that may impact auditor activity. So we don't want to repeat ISA 220, but we do plan to build out application material on how auditor biases relate to audit evidence. And one of the biases we want to make sure we focus on is automation bias, so the risk that the auditor over relies on technology. So we're working on that material with the professional skepticism group and the technology group, and we will obviously feed that back. There's obviously, of course, a lot of other activity in relation to skepticism in the material that I've talked about previously. So it's not that this is just the only activity that we're doing there. There's a lot more there, but these are probably some of the specific actions to highlight. We've still got a couple of issues on skepticism that we haven't discussed with the board yet. So the meaning of a critical assessment of audit evidence that's in the definition of professional skepticism, and some further linkages with fraud. And we've highlighted there as well detection risks. So the link between audit evidence and quality management at the engagement level has come up a couple of times in our board discussion, and that's something that we're still working on. Next slide, please. So that's a summary of where we are. I appreciate that there's been an awful lot going on, and we've been picking off issues to now sort of build them back in together to the standard itself. So the next step is March 2022. We have the IAASB and the CAG meetings. We will be having a first read of the full draft of ISA 500 with the accompanying guidance with technology examples. We will also be looking at some initial direction on conforming and consequential amendments to other standards. And I would just say that given the pervasive nature of ISA 500, there are quite a lot that we've been initially considering. So there will be some thoughts there. We'll need some guidance there. So Jim, I think that's an overview of where we've got to. I'm not sure where we've got with catching up time, but obviously very happy to take questions and comments.
Thank you, Sue. This morning, Lynn gave us the special consideration standard, and today you gave us the reference framework. So we're getting a bunch of good terms here, and thank you for that comprehensive summary. I will open it up for anyone who has questions and comments on evidence. Akihito.
Thank you, James. Thank you. I appreciate your very helpful presentation. Let me share two comments, observation quickly. And the first is regarding information to be used as audit evidence. I think that it may be better to include the examples of source of the information. That is difference in the case of external evidence from the third party, external evidence from related party, external evidence obtained from audit client, or internal evidence, as well as be used for in order to support the practice. The second is regarding technology. It may be useful to include the reminder against audit bias, considering the recent environment. On the other hand, sufficient outreach activities are needed to ensure that the benefits of the use of technology are not lost, and that a balance should be taken into consideration between efficiency in determining the relevant audit procedure, audit approach, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Hyson.
Okay. Thank you, Sue, for a very good presentation about changing in ISA 500 about audit evidence. Of course, there is just the initial stage of this, and we got a very good informative, good information about this. But my suggestion is to consider also a kind of conforming consequential amendments or things to be linked also with the other project on standalone standard on less complex entities, because even there is something about the audit evidence and it will be harmonized in my opinion. So thank you. That's I wanted to add.
Thank you, Hyson. Well, so you gave a lot of information for us to think about. Do you want to respond to the comments?
Yeah, I think three very good suggestions actually. Akita, I think you've identified some different parts of third-party information, and certainly we will take that away. I think we have examples on a number of those different ones, but I think that's very helpful. And I think I can only say yes, I agree. Your comment on technology. We have the reminder, but also it's striking that balance about retaining or using and harnessing the benefits. So that's very helpful. And Hyson, well, my heart probably sank when you said about the consequential amendments to the LCE standards, having only just voted it out for exposure, but absolutely. I mean that will be. I think the intention with the LCE standard is that as we issue new standards, part of the work we do is to think about the updates that are needed to that standard. So absolutely, it will be on the work plan, I'm sure.
Sue, we have one more question from Hilda. Hilda?
Thank you very much. Hi, Sue. Very quick suggestion. When we looked at the material, obviously you are still working on it, and especially the areas where you're still exploring, like on technology, like on professional judgment, like on external evidence. At times we were wondering, will you also consider, where does it stop as far as what procedures the auditor should do? What are the boundaries? And just a suggestion to consider that also in your further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilda. Yeah, we'll certainly reflect on that.
Thank you. Well, Sue, I think we're about to hit time. Thank you for that presentation. And for CAG members, we're not done. We have one more section for today, and then we'll talk about tomorrow. But the next section we have is what's called our private section. And so the private section or session is for people that are actual full members. So observers and staff need to depart, and then we will give it. It'll take a couple seconds to set up the. Set up the room, but we'll set up the room and then we'll start our private section. So if you're not a member of the CAG, you probably shouldn't be in the private session. Thank you.